90% of Christians don't know this exists. There is something hidden in plain sight, something most believers walk past every day without ever realizing it. Churches have spoken about faith, prayer, salvation, and spiritual warfare for centuries. Yet there is a reality inside the spiritual world that many Christians never truly understand. And the shocking part, it's not new. It has always been there. Written between the lines of Scripture, revealed through patterns, warnings, and spiritual experiences that many people ignore. Most people think the spiritual world is simple. Good versus evil, heaven versus hell, angels versus demons. But the truth is far deeper than that. The Bible hints at dimensions of spiritual influence, unseen battles, and hidden strategies that operate quietly around believers every single day. And if you don't recognize them, they can shape your life without you even knowing it. Many Christians pray, but they don't understand why certain struggles repeat. They read Scripture, but some verses feel mysterious or difficult to explain. They sense something spiritual happening in their life, but they cannot put it into words. And this is exactly why this message matters, because what we're about to talk about is something most people were never taught properly, not because it isn't real, but because it requires awareness, discernment, and spiritual maturity to recognize it. Tonight, we are uncovering something that will completely change how you see your faith, your struggles, and even the people around you. Something that exists, but most Christians overlook. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. This is the hidden reality many believers are waking up to, and it might already be affecting your life. So listen carefully. The invisible influence most believers ignore. Here is the first thing many Christians do not realize. Not every battle in your life is physical, emotional, or psychological. Some battles are spiritual influences operating quietly behind situations, relationships, and decisions. The problem is, most believers only recognize spiritual warfare when it becomes obvious. When something dramatic happens, when fear shows up, or when life suddenly collapses. But spiritual influence rarely works that way. It is subtle. It whispers instead of shouting. It plants thoughts instead of forcing actions. It slowly shapes perception until people believe the struggle is just normal life. And this is where many Christians lose awareness, because the unseen realm does not always attack with chaos first. Sometimes it starts with confusion. Sometimes it begins with discouragement. Sometimes it appears as doubt that slowly grows over time. A believer might suddenly feel distant from God without understanding why. They might lose motivation to pray. They might start questioning things they once believed strongly, and they assume it's just stress, emotions, or life circumstances. But what many people don't realize is that spiritual influence often targets the mind first, because once the mind becomes clouded, the heart follows. And once the heart grows tired, faith begins to weaken. This is why awareness matters. Not fear, not panic, awareness. Because the Bible repeatedly hints that believers must stay spiritually alert, not paranoid, but awake. And the reason most Christians never notice this reality is because no one explains how subtle spiritual pressure can actually be. It doesn't always look dark. Sometimes it just looks like distraction, endless scrolling, constant noise, a busy life that slowly pushes God into the background. And before a person realizes it, months or even years pass, and they wonder why their spiritual fire faded. But here is the truth that shocks many believers when they finally understand it. Some battles in your life were never random. They were spiritual resistance. And once you understand this, your perspective begins to change. But this leads to something even more surprising. The pattern that reveals something is happening spiritually. If you look closely at your life, you might notice something strange. Certain struggles appear right when you are about to grow spiritually, right when you decide to get closer to God, right when you start praying more, right when you begin changing your habits. Suddenly, distractions increase, problems appear, conflicts arise, opportunities to give up become stronger. This is a pattern many believers experience, but rarely talk about. And here is what most people never realize. Spiritual resistance often shows up when your life is moving in the right direction, not when you are far away from purpose, but when you are getting closer to it. This is why some people feel the most pressure right before breakthrough. The enemy of your soul doesn't always need to destroy you. Sometimes it only needs to slow you down, delay you, distract you, keep you spiritually tired. And that's enough, because a distracted believer is far less dangerous than a focused one. But here is where it becomes even more interesting. Many Christians think spiritual warfare is only about obvious evil. But in reality, one of the biggest hidden forces is spiritual dullness, a slow fading of awareness, a quiet drifting away from spiritual sensitivity, not overnight but little by little. And this is why so many people don't recognize it exists, because it feels normal, it feels ordinary, until one day they realize they are not as close to God as they once were. And that realization can be shocking. But here's the good news. Once someone becomes aware of this hidden reality, everything changes. Their prayer becomes stronger, their focus becomes sharper, their spiritual vision becomes clearer, because awareness breaks the power of what once remained hidden. And this is only the beginning, the hidden realm many Christians were never taught about. There is a reality that many believers sense, but very few truly understand. It's the unseen layer of influence operating behind everyday life. Not just good and evil in the general sense, but a structured, spiritual world that the Bible quietly reveals in different moments. Most Christians grow up hearing simple ideas about heaven and hell, angels and demons. But the deeper message Scripture hints at is that the spiritual realm is active, organized, and constantly interacting with the physical world. And here's what surprises many people when they begin to study this more closely. Spiritual activity doesn't only happen during dramatic moments. It happens during ordinary days, during conversations, during decisions, during moments when no one else is watching. The unseen realm is closer than most people realize. But the reason many Christians never notice it is because modern life trains people to only believe what they can physically see. If something cannot be measured, touched, or explained logically, many people automatically ignore it. Yet the Bible repeatedly teaches that the physical world is not the only reality influencing human life. There are spiritual forces of encouragement and spiritual forces of opposition. There are moments when divine help is guiding someone away from danger. And there are also moments when spiritual pressure tries to redirect someone away from their purpose. But here's the part most believers were never taught clearly. Not every spiritual battle looks dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a door closing unexpectedly. Sometimes it looks like a strange delay that later turns out to be protection. Sometimes it looks like a sudden conviction that stops you from making a mistake. And sometimes it looks like a heavy feeling that appears right when you're about to do something meaningful for God. Many Christians ignore these moments because they think spiritual events must look supernatural or obvious. But often, they are quiet, subtle, almost hidden. And that is why many believers go their entire lives without recognizing how active the spiritual realm truly is. But once someone starts paying attention, patterns begin to appear. Moments that once seemed random suddenly start making sense. Situations that felt confusing begin to reveal a deeper meaning. And this awareness changes how a believer walks through life, because they begin to realize something powerful. They were never walking alone. But what most Christians still don't understand is that there is something even more surprising happening around believers who are growing spiritually. And that leads to the next truth many people are only now beginning to discover: why some believers experience unusual spiritual pressure. Here is something that surprises many Christians when they finally understand it. Not all believers experience the same level of spiritual resistance. Some people go through seasons where life feels relatively calm spiritually, but others notice something very different happening in their lives. Strange opposition, unexpected conflict, sudden discouragement right when they are trying to move forward. And for a long time, many believers think something is wrong with them. They assume they are failing spiritually. They think maybe they are not praying enough, or maybe God is distant from them. But the truth can actually be the opposite. Sometimes the reason pressure increases is because your spiritual awareness is growing. Because when someone begins to seek God seriously, their life begins to change. Their mindset shifts, their priorities shift, their habits shift. And when that happens, the spiritual environment around them also responds. This is something that many mature believers eventually recognize. The closer you move toward purpose, the more resistance tries to appear, not to destroy you instantly, but to exhaust you, to make you question yourself, to make you slow down, to make you stop. Because if someone can be discouraged long enough, they might walk away from the very thing God is calling them toward. And that is why many believers experience a strange pattern in their lives. Right before growth comes pressure. Right before clarity comes confusion. Right before breakthrough comes distraction. But here is the powerful truth most people never hear. Pressure does not always mean you are going the wrong direction. Sometimes it is confirmation that you are moving in the right one. And once a believer understands this, something shifts inside them. They stop interpreting every challenge as failure. Instead, they begin to see challenges as moments where their faith is becoming stronger. But there is still another hidden reality many Christians don't recognize. Something that explains why some people remain spiritually aware, while others slowly drift away without realizing it. The quiet strategy that slowly weakens faith. If there is one thing most Christians underestimate, it is how slowly spiritual disconnection can happen. People often expect faith to disappear through a dramatic moment, a crisis, a major mistake, a sudden turning away from God. But that's usually not how it happens. Most of the time, it happens quietly, almost invisibly. It starts with small shifts, a little less prayer, a little more distraction, a little less time reflecting, a little more noise from the world. And at first, nothing seems wrong. Life continues normally. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and slowly, something begins to change inside a person. Their spiritual sensitivity fades. Things that once convicted their heart no longer feel as strong. Moments that once inspired them now feel distant. And the most dangerous part of this process is that many people don't notice it happening, because the change is gradual. This is one of the reasons why so many believers never realize what truly exists around them spiritually. Not because the spiritual world disappeared, but because their awareness slowly went quiet. And this is a strategy that has affected countless people throughout history. Not sudden destruction, but slow distraction. Because distraction keeps people comfortable, while their spiritual focus fades. And when that happens, purpose becomes blurry, discernment becomes weaker, and faith begins to feel heavy instead of powerful. But here is the truth that changes everything. The moment someone becomes aware of this process, it loses its power, because awareness awakens faith again. Awareness restores focus. Awareness reminds believers that their spiritual life was never meant to run on autopilot. It was meant to be active, alive, and intentional. And when someone wakes up spiritually again, things begin to shift. Their prayers become deeper. Their decisions become wiser. Their spiritual strength begins to return. But the next part reveals something even more shocking that many believers have experienced, yet very few understand what it means. And once you understand it, you will start seeing your life differently. The moment when spiritual awareness suddenly wakes up, there comes a moment in many believers' lives that feels almost impossible to explain. A moment when something inside them suddenly becomes aware again. It's as if a veil that once covered their spiritual perception begins to lift. For some people, it happens during a difficult season, when life pushes them to their knees in prayer. For others, it happens quietly in the middle of an ordinary day, when a thought, a realization, or a conviction hits their heart so strongly that they know something deeper is happening. And this is something many Christians have experienced, but very few talk about openly. It's the moment when you start noticing things you never noticed before. Patterns in your life, warnings you once ignored. Moments when you were protected without realizing it. Times when something inside you told you not to go somewhere, not to trust someone, or not to make a certain decision. And later you understood why. This is when a believer begins to understand that spiritual awareness is real. Not imagination, not coincidence, but a deeper connection forming between their spirit and God's guidance. And this is where something powerful begins to happen. Because once someone starts becoming spiritually aware again, their mindset changes. They begin to slow down and observe more carefully. They begin to question whether every opportunity is truly meant for them. They begin to pray differently and not just asking for blessings, but asking for discernment. And discernment is one of the most overlooked spiritual gifts many believers never develop, because discernment allows someone to sense when something is not right, even before evidence appears. It helps believers recognize spiritual influence before it becomes a problem. But here's the part most Christians don't realize. The moment your awareness begins to wake up, the distractions around you often increase. Noise becomes louder. Temptations become stronger. Situations try to pull your attention away. Why? Because awareness makes a believer spiritually dangerous to the forces that once kept them distracted. A spiritually awake person begins to move differently. They pray with intention. They speak with authority. They notice traps before stepping into them. And that is something the unseen battle does not want. But there is another reality connected to this awakening that surprises many people. Because when awareness grows, some relationships and environments begin to feel different. And this leads to something that many believers experience but struggle to explain. Why some people suddenly feel different around you. One of the most confusing experiences for many believers happens when their spiritual awareness begins to grow. Suddenly, certain people start reacting to them differently. Conversations change. Some friendships begin to feel uncomfortable. Some individuals who once supported you now seem distant. And this can feel confusing at first, because you may not understand what changed, but something did change. Your spiritual sensitivity. When someone begins to grow spiritually, their energy, decisions, and priorities begin to shift. They no longer tolerate the same distractions. They no longer feel comfortable in environments that pull them away from God. They begin to notice negativity more clearly. They begin to recognize manipulation, dishonesty, or unhealthy influence faster than before. And because of that, the dynamics around them begin to change. This is something that many believers experience but rarely talk about openly. Growth sometimes reveals who is truly aligned with your spiritual direction and who is only connected to an older version of you. But here is what most Christians don't understand. This process is not punishment. It is alignment. When God begins guiding someone more clearly, their path naturally shifts. Some people will walk with you on that path. Others will slowly fade away from it. And while this can feel uncomfortable, it is often part of spiritual maturity. Because growth requires separation from certain influences that once kept you stagnant. But here is where it becomes even more interesting. Sometimes the resistance does not only come from people. Sometimes it comes from internal battles, doubt, fear, overthinking. A voice in your mind telling you that maybe you're imagining everything. And this is one of the most common tactics that causes believers to ignore what they are sensing spiritually. They start second-guessing their awareness. They start convincing themselves that nothing unusual is happening. And little by little, the awareness begins to fade again. This is why spiritual confidence is important. Not arrogance, but confidence in your connection with God. Because when a believer trusts that God is guiding them, they stop ignoring the signals that once protected them. And once someone reaches that level of clarity, something powerful begins to happen in their life. They start moving with purpose. But what most Christians still don't realize is that there is one final hidden truth about this that changes everything. And when you understand it, you will never look at your life the same way again. The hidden truth about why this exists. Now here is the question many believers eventually ask when they begin noticing all of this. Why does this exist in the first place? Why would the spiritual world operate in ways that most people don't easily recognize? Why wouldn't everything just be obvious? The answer is deeper than most people expect. Because faith has always required awareness, not just belief. Many people believe in God, but they live spiritually asleep. They go through life reacting to events without understanding the deeper battle happening behind them. But those who begin to wake up spiritually start seeing life differently. They understand that every decision carries weight. Every relationship influences direction. Every moment of obedience strengthens something inside them, and every moment of distraction weakens something as well. This is why spiritual awareness exists, not to scare believers, but to prepare them. Because the world is full of voices trying to guide people in different directions. Some voices lead toward purpose, others lead away from it. And if someone cannot recognize the difference, they can spend years walking the wrong path without realizing it. But once someone becomes aware, everything shifts. Their prayers become focused. Their intuition becomes sharper. Their peace becomes stronger, because they know they are walking with guidance instead of confusion. And here is the truth many Christians discover later in life. The spiritual world was always there. The influence was always present. The guidance was always available. But awareness is what unlocks it. And once a believer begins living with that awareness, their life starts to change in ways they never expected. But the next part reveals something that might surprise you even more. Because there is a specific sign many believers experience when God is trying to get their attention. And most people completely miss it. The sign most believers completely miss. There is a moment that happens in the life of many believers, but almost no one recognizes what it truly means when it happens. It is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. In fact, most of the time, it is quiet. So quiet that people dismiss it as coincidence. But those who pay attention realize later that it was actually a sign. A moment when God was trying to get their attention. It often begins with a strong inner feeling that something in your life needs to change. Not because someone told you, not because circumstances forced you, but because something deep inside, your spirit starts whispering that you cannot continue the same way anymore. Some people feel it when they are about to make a decision that could change their future. Others feel it when they are surrounded by the wrong environment. And some feel it when they realize they have been spiritually distant for too long. It's a moment of spiritual awareness that interrupts normal thinking. A moment when your heart becomes unusually sensitive. You start reflecting more deeply. You begin questioning whether your current direction truly aligns with your purpose. But here is the reason most Christians miss this sign. Because it doesn't look supernatural. There are no flashing lights, no voices from the sky. No dramatic event that confirms it instantly. Instead, it feels like conviction, a gentle but persistent pressure inside your spirit. And many people ignore it. They tell themselves they are overthinking. They distract themselves with busyness. They push the feeling away because change feels uncomfortable. But the truth is, this moment is often the beginning of a spiritual turning point. A moment where God is inviting someone to wake up again, to realign their life, to step away from what has been draining their spirit, and step toward something greater. And when believers ignore this sign repeatedly, something slowly begins to happen. Their spiritual sensitivity weakens. The voice that once guided them becomes quieter, not because God stopped speaking, but because the noise of life became louder. But when someone responds to that inner conviction instead of ignoring it, everything begins to change. Clarity increases, peace returns, direction becomes stronger, and suddenly life starts making more sense. But there is another truth many Christians don't understand about this moment. Because when someone begins responding to spiritual guidance, something unexpected often happens next. And this next stage is where many believers either grow stronger or fall back into distraction again. The battle between comfort and calling. After a believer begins noticing spiritual signs and becoming aware again, a new battle often begins, and this battle is not always external. Most of the time, it happens inside the heart and mind. It is the battle between comfort and calling. Comfort is familiar. Comfort feels safe. Comfort keeps life predictable. It tells you to stay where things are easy, even if you know deep down that you are meant for something more. But calling is different. Calling challenges you. Calling stretches you. Calling asks you to grow, change, and sometimes leave behind what once felt normal. And this is where many Christians struggle without even realizing it. Because when God begins guiding someone toward a new direction, their old habits begin to resist that change. Their routine tries to pull them back. Fear begins to whisper questions like, what if I'm wrong? What if this is too difficult? What if things don't work out? And suddenly the path forward feels uncertain. But here is what most believers don't realize. This moment is actually a test of spiritual maturity, because growth always requires leaving something behind. Sometimes it's a mindset, sometimes it's an environment, sometimes it's relationships that no longer align with your direction. And while this process can feel uncomfortable, it is also where transformation happens. Many of the people who eventually grow strong in their faith went through this exact stage. A moment where they had to choose between staying comfortable or following what they sensed God was leading them toward. And those who chose growth discovered something powerful. The moment they stepped forward in faith, new strength appeared. New opportunities appeared. New clarity appeared. Because God often reveals the next step only after someone is willing to move. But there is still one more truth that many believers discover near the end of this journey. A truth that explains why only a small number of people fully recognize what exists spiritually around them. And understanding this final part can completely change how someone lives their life from this point forward. Why only a few people truly become spiritually aware. Here is something that may surprise many believers. Not everyone reaches deep spiritual awareness. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires something many people are not willing to maintain. Consistency. Spiritual awareness is not just a moment. It is a lifestyle. It requires a person to stay connected, focused, and intentional about their relationship with God. And this is where most people slowly drift away again. Life becomes busy. Responsibilities increase. Distractions multiply. And little by little, people return to autopilot living. They still believe in God. They still pray sometimes. But the deep awareness they once felt begins to fade. And that is why many Christians never fully realize what exists spiritually around them. Because awareness requires attention. It requires stillness in a noisy world. It requires listening when everyone else is rushing. But those who maintain this awareness begin to experience something different in life. They start noticing guidance earlier. They sense danger before stepping into it. They feel peace even during difficult seasons. And people around them sometimes notice it too. There is something different about them. A calm confidence, a quiet strength, a clarity that cannot easily be explained. Because they are not just reacting to life anymore. They are walking with spiritual understanding. And once someone reaches that level of awareness, they rarely return to the way they used to live. Because they realize something powerful. God was always working behind the scenes, always guiding, always protecting, always inviting them to grow closer. But most people were simply too distracted to notice. And that leads to the final part of this message, where everything comes together in a way many believers never expected. The moment everything finally makes sense, there comes a point in the journey of a believer when something powerful happens. A moment when all the confusion, all the strange patterns, all the seasons of pressure and growth suddenly begin to make sense. It doesn't happen instantly for everyone. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it happens after a season of deep reflection, prayer, and spiritual awakening. But when it happens, it changes how a person sees their entire life. They begin looking back at moments that once felt random. The times when a door suddenly closed. The times when something they wanted so badly didn't work out. The times when people walked out of their life unexpectedly. And instead of feeling confused about those moments, they start realizing something surprising. They were being redirected, protected, guided in ways they couldn't understand at the time. This is one of the most powerful realizations many believers eventually have. Not everything that looked like a setback was actually a loss. Some things were spiritual protection, some things were preparation, and some things were necessary changes that had to happen in order for a person to move closer to their purpose. But here's the truth that many Christians don't realize until this moment of clarity arrives. God often works quietly behind the scenes, not always in ways that people immediately recognize, not always in ways that make sense at first, but always with intention, always with wisdom beyond human understanding. And when a believer finally reaches this level of awareness, their faith becomes stronger than it has ever been before, because they stop judging their life based only on what they can see right now. Instead, they begin trusting that something greater is unfolding, even during difficult seasons, even during moments of uncertainty. And this is where spiritual maturity truly begins, when someone no longer needs constant signs to believe God is working, because they have already seen enough evidence in their life to trust the process. They realize something most people never fully understand, that their life has never been random. There has always been a spiritual story unfolding behind every chapter. And once a believer sees that, fear begins to lose its power, doubt becomes weaker, confidence in God becomes stronger. But this realization leads to one final truth that many people need to hear today, because the reason this message matters might actually be connected to you. Yeah, you listening right now, because there is a reason this message reached you. And that reason leads directly into the final moment of this video. Why you were meant to hear this today. If you've watched this entire message until now, there is a possibility that something inside you has been resonating with what you've heard. Maybe you've been noticing strange patterns in your life. Maybe you've felt a spiritual pull recently that you couldn't explain. Maybe you've gone through seasons where things felt confusing, but deep down you sensed that something bigger was happening. And here is something important to understand. Not everyone would stay until this moment. Most people would have clicked away earlier. Most people would ignore a message like this and move on with their day. But you didn't. And sometimes, that alone says something, because awareness often begins with a single moment where someone stops, listens, and starts seeing life differently. Maybe this video was that moment for you, a moment where your perspective begins to shift, a moment where you start paying attention to what God might be doing in your life right now. Because here is the truth many believers eventually discover. God often reaches people in quiet ways, through a message, through a realization, through something that suddenly makes them reflect deeper than usual. And that moment can become the beginning of a new chapter in someone's life. A chapter where faith becomes stronger, where distractions lose their grip, where purpose becomes clearer. But the most powerful part is this. Spiritual awareness is not something reserved for a few people. It is available to anyone who is willing to slow down, listen, and seek God sincerely. And if something inside you has been waking up recently, if you've been feeling that pull to grow closer to God, that is not something you should ignore, because that might be the beginning of something important. A new direction, a new level of understanding, a new season in your spiritual journey. And many believers who experience this moment later realize that it was the point where their life truly started changing. So the real question now is not whether this hidden reality exists. The real question is, what will you do now that you know? Will you continue living the same way? Or will you begin paying closer attention to what God might be showing you from this point forward? Because the moment someone becomes aware, everything can change. And sometimes, the people who discover this truth end up helping others wake up as well, which might be exactly why this message reached you today.